Now this is Department S touching down in fine style with yet another edition presented by the world's famous OPAL frequencies in service. Now this particular episode will be surprisingly short because it's appealing to the yellow and the green in a person, which, as the present company may be aware, that's speaking about the emotion and the sexuality. Now, this is not to do with the lower sexuality, and it's not to do with the physical eyes, but it certainly is to do with conceiving, but the conception is taking place in the mind's eye or the intuition of a person, because they've done the work to be able to see clearly what's being presented. Now, the following is an analogy to end all analogies, beginning with the premise of sleep. Now, as one is aware, sleep is a very necessary part of our lives, but very little is known about it. Now, the great mistake that people tend to make about sleep is to see it as 50% of their life, but really, if the average person spends 8 hours sleeping, it's actually 1/3. So 1/3 of our life is spent going somewhere or in a process that we know absolutely nothing about. And so sleep is a world that's unconscious to us. That's the first third. The reason why sleep is more important than anything else is because if you don't sleep, you actually can't function properly and you start to lose your mind the less sleep you have. So sleep must be more important than anything else, because you can tell how important something is by the length of time you can do without it. And no one can do without sleep after a certain time. It's far more important than anything else. So this is why sleep and the 8 hours spent unconscious that is not known about, the 8 hours spent in the astral worlds that very little is documented about, is custodial because it's the most important part. Directly beneath sleep is a grey area, which is to do with falling asleep or waking up. This suggests the process of sleep takes on two directions. Falling asleep, which is moving up and becoming conscious of the astral worlds, or becoming awake, which is moving down, and that's becoming conscious of the physical worlds. So the middle area is an area of transition between the high and the low. Now, this is something that a person shouldn't believe. They've got to not believe it, take it away, check it out, and try and disprove it. And if they can't disprove it, they have to ask themselves, what does this say about a master teacher by the name of Bishop, whose whole teaching and information and so-called knowledge is based on a premise that is incorrect, the law of two, which is apparent opposites. Nothing in creation expresses itself in two. It may appear to be two, it's actually three. And this can be proven when it comes to being awake and being asleep. Very few people consider the fact that when a person is awake, that's one thing, and when a person is asleep, that's another. But when they're neither awake or asleep, but either falling asleep or waking up, that's a third vector. So there's 3/3 and not 2 halves. And any teaching at all that claims to be representing the universe, creation, God, the spirit, or anything lofty like that, and does not take into account the eminence of the law of three, is false, and cannot be trusted. Now, once establishing the law of three is a principle, this then applies to everything we put our mind to, including sleep. But realize you can only be in 2 parts of the 3-part system at any time. This is clear. A person is either awake and falling asleep, or asleep and waking up. But they're never awake and asleep at the same time. This is impossible. This is the highest contradiction whatsoever, for someone to suggest that they are awake and asleep at the same time. Now, if a person can only be in 2 parts of the 3-part system at the same time, it means they're either semi-conscious and conscious, which is how a person lives their day, floating between the semi-conscious and the unconscious. Person speaking to them and they're listening to them consciously, but they're also semi-consciously asking themselves what they think and how they feel about what it is they're listening to. So this is 2 parts of the 3-part system, but it's the lower part. The higher part would be a person's in their semi-conscious and their unconscious, and they're entertaining thoughts and ideas that are so deep and profound that someone's standing next to them and talking to them, and even though they're wide awake with their eyes open, then they can't hear them. They didn't register their voice. They had no idea what they said because their mind had gone somewhere else and had become unconscious of what was around them, semi-conscious of some shocking thought or idea, something that they hadn't seen before, and then possibly conscious of the devastating or illuminating fact. You see, now that's not too difficult to understand, because all that's being said is nothing happens from 49 to 50 to 51. Nothing happens like that. It's a transition. We don't wake up immediately and we don't fall asleep immediately, because if that did happen, this world could not run. It would be very unsafe to drive a car, fly an aeroplane, this kind of thing. But the point again is to remember the 2/3, 1/3. 2/3 awake, 1/3 asleep. 2/3 asleep, 1/3 awake. Well, you see, this is where things become rather interesting, because how possible is it for a person to fall asleep? How possible is it for a person with all these provisions, with all these instinctual transitions in place? Because the reason why we don't immediately fall asleep is because it's to keep us safe, you see. The instinct wants to keep us safe. So there's a transition, there's a warning, alert. You're going to be falling asleep soon. You better find a safe place. Pull over, lie down, sit in a chair, don't operate machinery. This kind of thing. That's the instinct doing its job. So the question then is, if a person is awake, how possible is it for them to just immediately fall asleep? The answer is, it's not possible. It's not possible for someone to just immediately fall asleep. Just like it's not possible for someone to just immediately wake up. People wake up quickly, yes, and people fall asleep quickly, but it's not immediately. There's a transition. In all cases, there's a transition. So you see, if that's the case, when Bishop sits down in front of someone and he says, I'm in my lower self, there's got to be a transition that people can see as he moves from the lower self through to the middle self, the second self, into the higher self, the third self. There's got to be a transition, because everything in nature suggests that that's what's got to happen. So where is the transition? When Bishop is talking to people and suddenly he's in his higher self, where is the transition? Because realize it cannot be the same. Bishop can't be the same after the transition. When a person is awake and they fall asleep, it's not the same. When it's daylight and suddenly it's nighttime, it's not the same. Steam and ice is not the same. The higher is not the same as the lower. So the question is, for people to ask Bishop, is what is the difference between his higher self and his lower self? Because when he's seen, there is no difference. When he's seen, there is no difference. Bishop's life is based on 50% what he likes and 50% what he doesn't like. 50% positive and 50% negative. Now the positive that Bishop likes is what he can take. And the negative that Bishop doesn't like is what he can't take. I'll say that again. The positive that Bishop likes in life is what he can take, what he can consume from other people, because he's got no energy himself, so he's a vampire. That's what he can consume. And the negative, as far as Bishop is concerned, is what he cannot consume. Then he gets angry, like a werewolf. And that's the alarm going off. It tends to, I don't know, it just does that. It's rather strange. So I'm going to talk through it this time. I ain't got time to waste. So yeah, the two natures of Bishop, anger and fear, the werewolf and the vampire. The vampire is full of fear. What's he afraid of? Light and mirrors. But that's besides the point. What's being said here is very simple. It's the analogy to end all analogies. If a person cannot put themselves to sleep, hypnosis aside, because nobody wants to go near the dark arts of hypnosis apart from someone like Bishop, because that's what he's dealing with, controlling the mind by suggesting a person doesn't have a mind of their own. But if you look at it logistically, just look at it simply. Nothing can go from day to night, from being awake to going to sleep in a second. There's a transition from high to low because there's a middle point. The conscious, which is the low, the unconscious, which is the high. Now it's impossible for the unconscious to come down into the conscious, but it is possible for the person to go up into the semi-conscious and then begin to touch the unconscious. And that's why sleep happens to a person. A person can't make themselves sleep. Sleep happens to a person. A person cannot make themselves sleep. Sleep attends a person and imposes itself on a person because it's higher than the person. But when you're awake, you're awake. When you're in the physical world, you're in the physical world. But if you make a transition, if a person says while they're walking around, I want to take a nap, no matter what they do, if their body can't connect to the essence of sleep, they're going to lie there for 8 hours and not get any sleep at all. That shows you that the high attends a person. It's the low that possesses. The high attends you. You can't force the high to attend you, and the high doesn't turn up in the low. A person has to rise up. A person has to be attended by something. Possession, on the other hand, is something entirely different. So the question is, how can a person be in their higher self and still be in a physical form, and then when you see them go into their lower self, they're still in a physical form, and there's no difference? There's absolutely no difference in the radiation, in the essence, in the emanation, in the language, in the voice, in the look in the eye, in the tonality, in the information. There's no difference. There's no difference, because the most Bishop is, since he doesn't believe in the semi-conscious, is a lower self split in two. And this two is man and God. But it's both low. It's both low. When he's in his lower self, it's him in his lower self. And when he's in his higher self, it's him in his lower self. It's two sides, by his own admission, of him. Now, if a person can dig what was mooted to thus far, the connection has been made. Until next time, I over I equals I continually.
Ooh, yeah. Yes, Mr. Know-it-all. Asked you about the cat, you told me off the rat. Asked you off the wind, and you told me off the valley. Yes, Mr. Know-it-all. If you walk down the street and chat with everyone you
Yes,
meet,
Mr. Know-it-all.
always bragging boast and pretend you know the most.
Yes, Mr. Know-it-all.
Sooner or later I know a day will
Yes,
come
Mr. Know-it-all.
when your own mind's gonna let you down. What you gonna do? Tell me what you gonna say. No one at all listen to the words you say. What you gonna do when no one will hear to you? Mr. Know-all, Mr. Know-all. Asked you about the gleaner, you told me of the star. Yet you carry news with an evil fire. I asked you about the bus, and you told me of the car. I know, yes I know, that the day will come. No one at all, no one will listen to you. Whoa. What you gonna do? Tell me what you gonna do. No one will listen to you. Oh, Mr. No one, you don't know nothing at all. Asked you about the cat, you told me of the rat.
Wake up out of your slumber. This is the tight one.